I could summarize this entire video with just one sentence. The more satisfying your sex life, the less likely you will need or have a lot of sex. I know this is probably a disappointing and sobering message for quite some people, but it can also be easily misinterpreted. It doesn't mean that in all cases having a more satisfying sex life means less sex. Actually, the contrary is true for some people. And it doesn't mean that I'm telling you that you should have less sex. Having less sex will not lower the density of your ego, and it will not increase your level of development and sexual or relationship satisfaction. It's a lighter ego state that will lead to less sexual needs. And it also doesn't mean that the people who hardly have any sex are satisfied with it. So as my conclusion can easily be misinterpreted, let's get into more detail on this. Let's start by having a look at the correlation between psycho-spiritual maturity and sexual maturity, because there clearly is one, and it's the underlying principle of this whole lesson. Already some 4,000 years ago, the ancient Egyptians linked hysteria, or what clinical psychologists now call histrionic personality disorder, to the womb and to sexual frustration. And also folk wisdom in many countries claims that sexual frustration due to a lack of sex can make people unpleasant. And the French even have a word for somebody who is unpleasant. They may call the person mal baisé, which can be translated as someone who needs to get laid. Maybe more important to mention here is the work of Wilhelm Reich, who spent his entire career researching the role of sex and orgasm for mental health. This controversial psychoanalyst claimed that the severity of every form of psychic illness is directly related to the severity of the genital disturbance. So what did Wilhelm Reich mean by this? He thought that good mental health was the direct result of the ability of surrendering to the sexual act. So in simple words, if you are able to have uninhibited sex in a natural way and achieve an orgasm without having to put effort into it, then you are mentally healthy and free from any type or form of psychological disorders. So in his view, the overwhelming majority of people are not able to experience their sexuality in a healthy manner, which is then the source of irrational actions and neurotic behavior. So Reich saw sexuality and anxiety as opposites, and he found that patients who had learned to experience complete genital surrender would see their neurotic anxiety symptoms disappear and their personality change. So the solution which Reich proposed to heal any psychological disturbance was very easy. Complete and repeated genital gratification. Well, his words have been misinterpreted and purposefully distorted by some people to justify promiscuity, which Reich actually strongly condemned. Instead, he thought his patients had to restore a natural attitude towards sexuality, because the body gathered sexual energy which had to be released in a healthy manner. If not, this blocked energy would lead to neurotic symptoms. So clearly, the views of Wilhelm Reich are very controversial, but let's not forget he's at the origins of Western body-based psychotherapy, and his influence on many therapists, directly or indirectly, has been massive. So, whereas Wilhelm Reich claimed that in order to be psychologically healthy, you need to learn to have sex in an uninhibited way, others are more of the belief that in order to have a satisfying sex life, you first need to get rid of your psychological issues. Well, I think that both are actually equally valid and true, and it's more of a two-directional interaction or process. Because by doing your inner work, you will show up in a more authentic way, which will make surrendering to the sexual act much easier. And this will give you a higher level of sexual satisfaction. But from the other side, I think the main message of Wilhelm Reich was that if you are sexually repressed because of shame and guilt around sex, then this will lead to psychological problems. So I agree with Reich that he can undo some mental health issues by getting rid of needless sexual repression. However, I do not believe that all psychological issues are entirely rooted in the blockage of sexual energy. Still, actively excluding sex and sexuality from your inner work is like pushing the brake pedal of your self-development. It's limiting how far you can go. If you are doing a lot of work on your childhood traumas, relationships with family, friends, colleagues, but you take out sex, it's like pushing the gas pedal and brake pedal at the same time. So this is actually a hopeful message. By doing your inner work, your sexual satisfaction will increase. And by working with the topic of sex, your psychological maturity will increase as well. So far, I haven't said much about the impact of sexual abuse and trauma in this course. Yet sexual abuse is unfortunately a rather common phenomenon. And there are three things I want to mention here. One is the role of the type. Two is the impact on the sexual experience and the ego state. And three is the impact of unprocessed sexual trauma on longer-term personal growth. The reaction to sexual abuse and trauma is very individual, and it'll depend a lot on how the environment or society deals with abuse, on the values of the person and the values of the family of the person, on the support this person can find, and so on. But also the Enya type and the ego state or level of development play a big role. Sexual trauma is not changing the defense mechanisms of our ego, it's just reinforcing it. So being reminded of the trauma will most often invoke a reaction which is based on the cognitive distortion of our type. And of course, it may destabilize a person, so you may not necessarily react like your type, but move towards a stress point and be stuck there for quite some time. It's logical that those types that are very assertive in boundary setting, like 8s, 1s, and 3s, may have less chances of ending up in certain forms of abuse because they can more easily walk away from certain abusive relationships. But others, like 9s and some 4s, may unfortunately be more prone to becoming a victim. And in terms of reaction after the abuse, also there we can see different approaches. Some 7s may just distract themselves and claim it wasn't such a big thing anyways, or they keep it inside, or they just run away and find some other pleasure. Or 9s may try to narcotize the negative feelings and claim that, well, things like that happen, and they may downplay it and they can keep the anger inside. Still, I don't want to go into too much details, as this is an area where most often professional support is definitely warranted. But something I want to go into more detail about is the ego state. You might intuitively think that trauma will determine one's ego state or one's level of development. But that's only partially true. You need to look at it in the other way, because it's actually the ego state or the level of development that will determine one's reaction to trauma. Somebody with a lighter ego state or a higher level of development and who has processed the trauma more or less will experience less negative impact of that negative experience than somebody with a heavier ego state or a lower level of development. If the person went through a healing process, his or her sexual response will be similar to that of anyone else of the same type, the same instinctual stacking and ego state. let's not forget that the ego state or level of development is a scale which determines how we deal with challenges in life, including with trauma. Now, the situation is quite different when the trauma has not been processed, when the healing has not yet taken place. Our ego state is not static, and it can change a bit throughout the day. When we feel resourceful, it may temporarily go up, but if we're in pain, if we are tired, or if a trauma gets triggered, we may temporarily go down. And this actually explains why your sexual performance may be different or even dysfunctional if you get triggered by some stressful situation or if you are extremely tired. So, when the sexual trauma is active, the ego state of the person may temporarily get heavier. The level of development may temporarily go down a bit. So, someone with an ego state of fear who has been sexually abused and does not seek help may temporarily move to the ego state of compulsion and destruction when this trauma gets triggered. Or someone with an ego state of enjoyment and who has been sexually abused and does not seek help will temporarily move to the ego state of fear or even to this compulsion and destruction. Now, their entire behavior and thinking will be dominated by this ego state in all spheres of life. And if they're not able to process at all, they may actually get stuck at this ego state. So instead of self-development, a traumatic event may lead to a certain psychospiritual degradation. And those who are able to somehow cope with this traumatic event and get a grip on their life may, after a few weeks or months, be able to get back to their usual ego state. However, if the trauma is not fully processed, they will get triggered when something reminds them of their trauma, and they may go back to a heavier ego state or a lower level of development each time they get triggered. And maybe an example may make it easier and may illustrate it. A woman with an ego state in enjoyment may have been sexually assaulted, and she may have been able to process it more or less. So most of her life, she's living her life from this ego state of enjoyment. However, the moment she's in a sexual situation with her partner, she may fall into fear or even worse, into compulsion and destruction. So this woman, who is functionally generally quite well in general, suddenly gets destabilized and experiences sexual dysfunction. So she's at one ego state most of her life, but in a different ego state when it concerns sex and sexuality. I think this is quite logical and won't amaze too many people. But what is maybe more interesting is that most people in the Western industrialized civilization are actually suffering from some form of sexual trauma. Sexual trauma is not only the result of sexual abuse, but it can stem from any other form of events that go against the natural aspects of sex and sexuality. Sexual repression can easily lead to sexual trauma in many people. And growing up with the idea that there's something wrong about sex, that one should feel guilt or shame for having sex, that sex is often sinful and so on, all of that creates mental and emotional blockages in a similar way as other traumatic events. And the fact that we're not able to speak normally about sex to family and friends already shows that we are traumatized. And you may not have thought about it, but the messages of sexual repression you got during childhood are also a form of sexual trauma. As a matter of fact, sexual repression can often lead to asexual abuse. Sex is a normal aspect of a mature marital relationship. But there are many couples where one of the partners may refuse sex to the other. And the refusing person may be sexually repressed and even claim the partner with a healthy sex drive to be a sex addict. But Eric Berne, the famous psychologist, even said that if a woman refuses a man too often, he will actually lose his potency. All of this explains why many people don't feel comfortable with the topic of sex, and why their sexual behavior and response does not correspond to what you would expect from their usual ego state. So people in fear may suffer from dysfunctions to the extent that it does not make this sexual act really pleasurable to them. Or people who are generally satisfied with life and are in an ego state of enjoyment may still not be able to enjoy the sexual act. So let's take that a bit further and look at the impact this has on our inner work and self-development. What does growth or self-development mean? A big part of it is to process our traumas so that they do not provoke an unhealthy or destructive reaction. So the focus of our work should be on our traumas. And refusing to deal with traumas is the same as pushing the brake pedal of your self-development. It does not allow you to go further. You can reach enjoyment in general in life and still have some sexual trauma or sexual repression. But it is not possible to reach the state of mastery without dealing with this. It's not possible to be truly in mastery without being able to enjoy the sexual act and to surrender to it. I think now we can move on to the link or correlation between psychospiritual maturity and sexual maturity. Not sexual maturity in the sense of being biologically mature enough to be able to become pregnant or to make a woman pregnant, but about the ability to experience sex and sexuality in a mature manner and in line with the healthy sexual act as Wilhelm Reich described. And let's go back quickly to video 2.4. I said that the ego states or levels of development are very much linked to the concept of connection. In the lighter ego states or the higher levels of development, we feel connected with the oneness, with the universe, with the divine, with everything around us. But in the heavier ego states or lower levels of development, our ego is so strong that we do not feel connected at all. Sex can easily be used to imitate this sense of connectedness. So the heavier our ego state, or the lower our level of development, the more we may want to use sex to seek this connectedness and to fill a lack of tenderness in one's life. However, don't forget that this is still an imitation. It may temporarily inspire and give inner strength to a person, but it's not the same as the energy one feels from truly and genuinely being connected with the divine. So let me expand a little bit on this spiritual or divine energy and its relations to sexual energy. And some of you may find this a bit esoteric, but I want to elaborate on a very important thought that is actually crucial in understanding the role of the ego states on the sexual function and sexual satisfaction. People with a lighter ego state, so with a higher level of development, feel strongly connected with oneness, unity, the divine, or whatever you want to call it. And this sense of connection is an incredible source of endless energy. They may feel as if they tap into the vast energetic resources of something higher. They don't need to feel important, rich, attractive, or anything like that to feel strong and empowered inside. This kind of spiritual or divine energy is the creative energy of our soul, of our metaphysical being, of the universe. So, in a mature ego state, our needs from the material realm are reduced because we get the energy from some kind of metaphysical force or realm. But sexual energy, on the contrary, is the creative energy of the material world, of our physical incarnation. We all experience this energy, but in the heavier ego state, so the lower levels of development, we may actually use the sexual energy to compensate for a lack of spiritual energy. Because the two are very similar. And as a matter of fact, sexual energy is more or less a manifestation of the spiritual energy, but in the material realm. Sexual energy can easily be abused to overcome a lack of connection with the divine. So to imitate a connection with the divine, to imitate the divine creative power. In spiritual energy, it's the divine that holds the ultimate power. In sexual energy, we can feel like God because we believe that we hold the ultimate power. And indeed, we hold the potential to create a new life. In sex, we can play God. And this can have a very gratifying feeling. So the lighter your ego state, the less you have the need to want to feel as powerful as God. So you still let the sexual energy flow through you because you're still in the material realm, but you no longer need sex. You get some strong energy from this metaphysical force inside of you. You don't need sex to imitate it. It's also important to understand that sex is just one way of dealing with this creative sexual energy. Sex is the most powerful way because orgasm gives a strong sense of connectedness. An orgasm is like an explosion of nuclear energy, and therefore it's important to handle it appropriately. You might compare the sexual energy with the stream of a river. The source replenishes the river, it's never ending. And the aim for the water is to reach the open sea or the ocean. The aim of using our sexual energy is to get to the divine. But not all water reaches the ocean. The river needs an embankment to guide the water in the right direction. And without this direction, the water could go in all kinds of directions. The water can go into different canals and irrigate land everywhere, but never reach the ocean. Or it can just end up in swamps and drain into the earth. So similarly, our sexual energy can also be dissipated and never reach a final goal. It can go in all kinds of directions. It can be spread thinly, it can be consumed and end up in an emotional swamp that's draining the energy. In the ego states of fear and enjoyment, we want to consume that sexual energy. In mastery and interest, we master the sexual energy. We give it direction. We let it flow through us, but we don't consume it. So after this long but important introduction, let's look at the influence of the ego state on the way we experience sex. We look at quantity or sexual needs, quality or sexual satisfaction, and non-monogamous desires. A common question I get is, what type has the most sex or who has the biggest sex drive? Well, there are some indications that certain types may have a higher sex drive or may act more on it. But further research is still needed to figure that out. Claudia Nario and Hugo Kruger are two Enneagram trainers and researchers who have looked at the role of neurotransmitters and the enneatypes. So, for example, there is a hypothesis that 8s have a higher level of testosterone than the other types. And if this is true, it would be very logical that 8s have a higher sex drive than others. And indeed, they can be very lustful. However, I believe there is something that is much more important than type-based hormone levels, and that is the ego state. In the heaviest or densest ego state, so in the lowest levels of development, we are the most separated from the divine. We have the least access to the powerful spiritual energy. We do not feel any abundance. We need a lot of ego gratification and fill the inner emptiness. The more we feel our basic instinctual needs have to be met, the more we have a fear of death. So the more we desire to live, which is exactly what libido is all about. So one way to seek ego gratification is through sex. The more ego gratification we seek, the more sex we will need. the more we want to meet our self-preservation needs of physiological release, the more sex we will need. The more we want to feel alive because of a strong sexual instinct, the more sex we will need. The more we want to feel that we have a strong bond with our partner because of the strong social instinct, the more sex we will need. So some self-preservation dominant people may have sex or masturbate every day because it can feel like a basic need, like eating or drinking or sleeping, that just needs to be fulfilled. And the need is high. Some sexual dominant people may have sex every day because a day without sexual excitement feels like a lost day. Every day without this strong connection with the partner is like one didn't live that day. Some social dominant people may have sex every day because having sex means that the relationship okay and the clock is reset. So not having sex one day may create a sense of anxiety about the state of the relationship. The fear of death and the desire to live also links back to the functions of sex we spoke about in lesson 2. So the procreational, recreational, and relational function. First of all, if we cannot live forever, we at least want to ensure our genes continue to live on eternally in the endless generations after us. The more offspring, the greater the chances of survival of our genes. And when the ego state is heavier, we have a greater fear of death, which activates our instinctual urges for procreation. And this doesn't mean that we want to have more children. No, it just means that the instinctual urges that drive us towards reproduction will be more activated. Secondly, our fear of death is our biggest source of stress and anxiety. And as a matter of fact, if we were to dig very deep, then we could reduce all our stress and anxiety back to our fear of death. Sex is probably the most efficient tool that nature gave to us to alleviate stress and to guarantee our survival, because it has given us the ability to reset or rebalance our central nervous system through orgasm. And this actually brings us back to the second function of sex, recreation. The main aim of recreation is to get rid of stress and anxiety, to improve our mood, to enhance our sense of wellness, to seek temporarily relief from our fear of death. So the heavier our ego state, the higher our need to use recreational activities that can lower our stress and anxiety and temporarily bring us in a different state of mind. Let's also have a look at the third function of sex, which is about the relational aspect. As we saw earlier on, the purpose of our bonding through sex is to increase our chances of survival, because sex gives us access to care and protection from our sexual partner. The heavier our ego state, the bigger our fear of being left alone, of not being able to live without the support of our social network. So I think I gave a long list of reasons why our need for sex or libido tends to be higher in the heavier ego states. But does that mean we have more sex or masturbate more in a heavier ego state? No, possibly, but not necessarily. It just means that there is a higher likelihood you will feel a strong urge. But there are different ways of acting on this urge. Many people indeed have a lot more sex in a heavier ego state, or at least they want to have this sex, but then gradually they have less sex as they move into the lighter ego states. However, this doesn't happen, or it doesn't apply to everybody. Because another dynamic I mentioned before is that the heavier our ego state, the stronger our sexual repression. So people with sex negative values will associate more shame and more guilt to sex in the heavier ego states. So the sex drive subconsciously may be high, but the negative emotions and social pressure put the lid very tightly on this hot pot. So, although subconsciously libido may be high, people may have only little sex out of a fear of going to hell, out of fear of losing the love of God, out of shame of being dirty and a disgrace. Fear and shame are very efficient libido killers. And very often, people are not even aware that they have these sex negative views. So, what may seem as an absence of a sex drive is in reality just repressed libido. It's still there, but it will come up in more nasty ways. I mean, just look at some conservative Christian societies in the US. Sexual abuse is prevalent in most religious communities, and it is often even higher than in secular communities. People who repress sex out of their conscious mind just transfer it into the unconscious. So instead of being spiritual, in reality, they avoid being present. They avoid living consciously. Now, most people in our contemporary society are somewhat in the middle of the spectrum between sex positive and sex negative values. Most of us are living in an environment that claims to be free and that indeed preaches some sex positive values, but the undercurrents still send repressive signals about sex. We see lots of nudity and sexualized content on TV and commercials, but there's a sense of shame about sex. Sex is everywhere, but we still don't feel at ease to talk about it to friends or family or even to our doctor. So, understanding how people deal with their sex drive is even more complex to understand in such a hybrid form because there is actually no consistency in our sexual values. And in this case, our type and the strength of our sexual instinct play an important role in how we deal with this ambiguity. So we cannot tell exactly how each type will act, but we can give some tendencies. So for example, the compliant types 1, 2 and 6 are more prone to give in to the repressive subcurrent in our society. On top of that, the psychological defense mechanism of type 2 is repression. So the entire type structure is based on pushing the needs and desires, including the sexual ones, into the subconscious. The core emotion of the hard types is shame. And some religions have used shame as a tool in this sexual repression. And as a result, types 2, 3 and 4 may be more prone to experience feelings of shame, a true libido killer when it comes to sex. Of course, type 3 is more able to dissociate itself from its own feelings and emotions, so they may be less prone to this type of sexual repression. Types 4 and 7 may be more prone to go against the rules, or at least not to feel restricted by them. So they may actually lower their sexual inhibitions. And finally, also the strength of the sexual instinct plays an important role. People with a dominant sexual instinct tend to have a more assertive and active approach towards sex. They are less likely to forsake their sexual desires, and they may be less willing to compromise on a not so active sex life. And people with the sexual instinct as their blind spot are more likely to use the sexual repression as a justification for not acting upon their desires. So this doesn't mean that sexual blind people have less sexual desire, it's just that they don't act upon them that strongly. So now that we've looked at quantity or strength of the sexual needs, let's move on to the quality of the sexual experience and the sexual satisfaction it gives. In short, the heavier the ego state, the lower the level of sexual satisfaction. And of course, then the lighter the ego state, the higher the level of sexual satisfaction. This does not mean that in a heavier ego state, the person does not like the sexual encounter. On the contrary, feeling the inner emptiness gives a great feeling, ego gratification can give a temporary rush of positive emotions and so on. So even in the heavier ego states, one can be happy with sex, but it's unlikely to lead to a deep felt state of satisfaction and gratitude towards a partner. So maybe I should elaborate a bit on what sexual satisfaction is. It's not about having great, passionate, spicy sex. It's more about the positive evaluation of one's sexual relationship. One can have great sex but still feel something is missing in the sexual relationship. And there are many elements that contribute to this sense of satisfaction. First of all, people with a denser or heavier ego state may often perceive there is some kind of sexual incompatibility with the partner. And in the lighter ego states, on the contrary, they feel more of a sense of complementarity. And throughout this course, I have spoken a few times already about this alleged incompatibility. When people with a heavy ego state, so for example fear or still enjoyment, when they seek ego gratification, they're very likely to perceive their partner as sexually incompatible. They are quite likely to feel as if the partner is not in tune with them, as if the partner perceives sex in an entirely different way, as if the partner doesn't understand what he or she should do, as if the partner is unable to give what they are looking for. And indeed, by giving meaning to sex, you look for something that cannot be found in sex. So very often there's a feeling that there is something wrong with the partner. But in reality, it's just a lack of understanding of the ego gratification which is specific to the type structure. Now, in the lighter ego states, such as in mastery or interest, there is almost no ego gratification, so there is no misunderstanding. Also, different instinctual stackings may lead to temperamental differences in the heavier ego states. Imagine a couple where one has a highly intense sexual dominance instinct and the other one is self-preservation dominant but sexual blind. It will be very difficult to meet each other energetically. However, in the lighter ego states, we are less stuck with our instinct. We are able to tap well into our repressed instinct, so we can reduce the intensity of the dominant instinct. So as a result, in the lighter ego states, these extremes have softened down a lot. A second element to this sexual satisfaction is what I would call the aftertaste of the sexual experience. In a very heavy ego state like compulsion and destruction, we hope that sex will energize us, but all it does is drain us from our vital energy. In fear and enjoyment, there is an energizing effect to sex. In fear, this energizing aftertaste may last just a few minutes or so, and in enjoyment, it may last for a few hours. In the lighter ego states, the long-lasting impact is much bigger. It may last for days or even weeks. Basically, in these lighter ego states, you're not driven by your passion, but by your virtue. And by tapping into this spiritual energy, you are getting in touch with something much more powerful. Thirdly, and very much related, whereas in the lighter ego states, we feel a strong and true emotional connection with the partner, we do not feel this in the heavier ego states. Paradoxically, most people with a heavy ego state will have an increased illusion of emotional connection. But in reality, they just relate their own projections or their own animus or anima. But they're not in connection with the partner. In the heavy states, we're not relating to the partner. We have little empathy. We just have expectations from our partner. Fourth is that the lighter the ego state, the easier it is to surrender to the sexual act, and as a result get a strong orgasm. It's really about surrendering to the sexual act, not surrendering to the partner. So some people may surrender to their partner as part of some BDSM activities, but not necessarily surrender to the sexual act. Surrendering is also not about passivity. On the contrary, surrendering requires active participation. Surrendering is all about the ability to give up control. In the heavy ego states, we want to remain in control of everything that happens, and we tend to blame our partner if we cannot surrender. But the lighter the ego state gets, the more we are able to surrender to the unknown and allow ourselves to be part of something bigger. As a matter of fact, very often we are physically making it impossible for ourselves to surrender. For example, by pushing the pelvis backwards, or by by tightly closing our lips. There is one exception though. Many people with a dominant sexual instinct, especially those who do not have too negative sexual values, actually seek the unknown. As a result, many of them may face little difficulties in surrendering. So we could easily mistake it actually for a lighter ego state. A fifth important thing is that the lighter our ego state, the less likely we will suffer from some kind of sexual dysfunction. And this is not only related to the ability to surrender, but also because there is no more impact from sexual trauma or sexual repression. There's a higher sense of freedom, so less inhibitions and less self-sabotaging. Finally, the ego states also show the capacity for being present. And sex requires presence, especially with the body and the heart. Those who are familiar with the teachings of Osho or have read his book From Sex to Superconsciousness, they will know that the sexual experience can be enhanced by practicing it the same way as meditation. By observing what is happening to your body and your emotions, by switching off the judgments and expectations, by accepting yourself, by just being present, you temporarily increase the level of development. So you practice being in the state of interest. And as a result, the sexual experience will be more powerful and its effects will be lasting longer in a lighter ego state. So if we merge the aspects of quantity or strength of the sexual needs with the quality of the sexual experience or sexual satisfaction, we can come up with the following conclusion. In fear, we mistake quantity for quality. Some believe that the quantity or frequency of sex is an indicator of the quality of the relationship, so the more the better. It's just a matter of meeting one's needs. Others believe that the quantity of sex is an indication of some kind of moral inferiority, an indication of some kind of weakness. So in their view, the less sex, the better. Neither of the two are giving too much attention to the deep felt sense of satisfaction the sexual interaction can bring. In enjoyment, we no longer have this unconscious approach to compulsively meeting our needs or repressing them. Instead, we start relaxing a bit about the urgency of these needs, and we try to get some enjoyment in the process of meeting these needs. So it's not just about filling an inner emptiness, but also about seeking some emotional well-being, emotional satisfaction. So here quality comes into the picture, but quantity is not yet forgotten at all. Both are important, so the key in enjoyment is to find some kind of balance. In mastery, quantity does not play an important role, as it's all about quality. The focus is on the satisfaction of the sexual experience. So finally, what's the link between the ego states and non-monogamous desires? I already said there is no type that is more likely to cheat or to seek out extramarital sex. So what about levels of development? I wouldn't dare say that in the lighter ego states of mastery and interest, non-monogamy is entirely absent. Yet there is a general trend that the lighter the ego state, the less the urge for non-monogamy will come up. So in the lighter states, it may still appear, but it's going to be a very conscious decision and part of some kind of agreement with all partners involved that will care for each other. So there is no drive, no urge, no compulsive need to seek out non-monogamy. As a matter of fact, in these lighter ego states, The question of monogamy or non-monogamy is less of a problematic issue, because the main concern is all about respect, responsibility, and healthy boundaries. However, let's focus a bit more on why there may be a stronger urge or need for non-monogamy in the heavier ego states. In the heavier ego states, there is less sexual satisfaction. There is a feeling the needs are not met. The ego gratification may not be good enough. So there may be a thought, which is most often naive, that things would be radically different if only there was a different partner. Something is missing with the primary partner. One cannot fully open up and be authentic. One may be traumatized in the relationship and so on. So the romantic idea of a better sex partner may come up quite automatically for some people. Compulsively seeking sex and sex addiction can appear in the heavy ego states, and this often also includes non-monogamy. Still, there's one big counter-argument to everything I said. Some people may have a strong fear of abandonment, so they may remain faithful and not give in to any non-monogamous desires. There is also some people who with compulsive ideas about monogamy, and any form of compulsivity is not good as it does not help in having an honest and open communication. So clearly there are certain trends we can notice, but it's difficult to fully generalize.